Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man who's shouting about unfair taxes directly beneath an opening in the ceiling where boiling water could be poured on him, but isn't, which means someone decided the threat of the hole is more useful than actually using it, or someone understands that violence works better as possibility than reality. This is about castle gatehouses in 13th century England, those passage spaces where everyone entering or leaving must pass beneath murder holes, those strategic openings in the ceiling designed for dropping stones or boiling liquids on enemies, but actually used to quiet complaints and cool tempers through unspoken threat that hovers over every conversation happening in that space. It's not about dramatic executions or obvious violence. It's about 1 year when a gatekeeper realizes the murder holes have never been used in his lifetime but control behavior more effectively than any actual violence could, and what that realization reveals about how architectural threat becomes social control, how unused violence shapes daily interactions, and how learning which threats are never executed but always present is how you understand which behaviors are controlled by fear of consequences that never actually happen.
Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about how threat controls behavior, about how unused violence shapes compliance, about the difference between what could happen and what actually happens, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments about times you've seen threats that work precisely because they're never executed. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these explorations of how architectural violence becomes psychological control. Now settle in, and let's discover what happens when a gatekeeper starts documenting how many times murder holes are referenced versus used, and realizes the entire system of gatehouse control operates through threats that are never fulfilled but never forgotten. The castle is Blackmore Keep in Yorkshire, and the year is 1272. It's a substantial fortress, Earl's residence. The gatehouse is 30 feet long, stone passage connecting outer bailey to inner courtyard. Everyone entering or leaving castle passes through this space. Above the passage are murder holes, 6 openings in vaulted ceiling, each about 18 inches square, allow guards in room above to observe passage below, allow dropping stones, boiling water, burning oil, arrows, anything that would stop enemies forcing their way through gatehouse. That's their defensive purpose. That's their designed function. But Blackmore Keep hasn't been besieged in 80 years, hasn't faced military attack since before anyone currently living there was born. The murder holes haven't been used for defense in 3 generations, yet they're maintained carefully, kept clear, kept visible, kept present in everyone's awareness. The gatekeeper is a man named Robert. He's 28 years old and has held this position for 5 years. He controls passage through the gatehouse, grants or denies entry, manages traffic, resolves disputes. And increasingly he's noticing how the murder holes function in his daily work, not as defensive features but as control mechanisms, as architectural threats that shape behavior without ever being used. That's what he's recognizing. That's what disturbs him. That's what this story explores.
Robert stands in the gatehouse passage multiple daily, watches people enter and exit, observes their behavior. The murder holes are always visible above, always present. People glance up at them, reference them, joke about them nervously. The holes shape interactions. When arguments start in the passage, and they start frequently because it's confined space where people meet, the murder holes quiet them. Not through actual use, through presence, through possibility. Robert watches this pattern. Man arrives with cart, demands immediate entry. Guard says wait. Man starts shouting, getting angry, getting aggressive. Then he glances up at murder holes, sees the 6 dark openings in the ceiling above him, sees that he's standing in space designed for killing people who cause trouble. His voice drops, his anger cools, his aggression disappears. Not because anyone threatened him, not because anyone referenced the holes, just because they're there, just because looking up reminds him where he is.
reminds him that this space was designed to kill people in his exact position. That architectural reminder is enough. That spatial awareness quiets him. The argument ends. The man waits patiently. Entry is eventually granted. Robert notes this pattern, notes how often it happens, how reliably glancing up at murder holes transforms behavior, how effectively unused architectural violence controls daily interactions. He starts documenting it, keeps private record. How many disputes start in the Gatehouse? How many quiet after people notice murder holes? How many times the holes are referenced verbally? How many times they're used actually? The numbers are striking. Disputes, dozens weekly. References to murder holes, multiple daily. Actual uses, 0 in 5 years. 0 in Robert's entire tenure. 0 in living memory, actually. Nobody Robert knows has ever seen the murder holes used for anything except their existence as threat. Yet they control behavior constantly, shape interactions.
Daily. Quiet tempers reliably, without ever being used. That's what Robert is documenting. That's what he's recognizing. That architectural violence, as pure threat, is more effective than actual violence. That unused holes control behavior better than used ones would. That the possibility of violence manages people more efficiently than violence itself. That's disturbing realization. That's what changes how Robert understands his position and the space he manages.
March 1272. A merchant arrives at Gatehouse. He's been denied entry by guard. Something about improper paperwork. The merchant is furious, starts shouting at guard, calls him incompetent, accuses him of corruption, demands to speak to Earl, gets increasingly loud, increasingly aggressive. Robert intervenes. "Sir, you need to calm down. Shouting won't help. You're standing in the Gatehouse, under the murder holes. You understand what that means." The merchant looks up, sees the 6 dark openings. His anger drains visibly. "I apologize. I'm frustrated, but I'll wait calmly while you review my papers." Robert examines documents, finds they are actually in order. Guard made mistake. Entry is granted. The merchant thanks Robert politely, leaves. The whole interaction took 2 minutes. Started with fury, ended with politeness. The transformation happened when Robert named the murder holes, reminded merchant of space he occupied, made architectural threat explicit. That explicit reminder worked instantly, cooled temper immediately, resolved situation without conflict. Robert thinks about what he did. He made threat, direct threat. You're under murder holes. Message is clear. Continue shouting, and something could be dropped on you. That's threat of violence. That's using architectural feature as weapon. But Robert didn't actually threaten to drop anything, didn't make specific threat of harm, just reminded merchant of space and its designed purpose. Let merchant's imagination supply the threat. Let architectural feature speak for itself. That indirect threat works perfectly, works better than direct threat might have, because direct threat could be called out, could be challenged, could be reported. But indirect architectural reminder, that's just explaining where someone is standing. That's just naming features of castle design. That's not threat legally, is threat practically, is threat psychologically, but not threat anyone can prosecute or challenge. That's elegant. Control. That's quiet justice. That's what the murder holes enable. Threat that's not quite threat. Violence that's not quite violence. Control that's not quite force. All operating through architectural features that were designed for one purpose and are being used for completely different purpose that's more effective and more troubling. Robert understands this now, understands that he's been using murder holes as a threat mechanism, that everyone using the Gatehouse has been, that the holes function primarily not as defense but as behavior control, that their presence shapes interactions more than their potential use ever could, that architectural violence as permanent possibility is perfect form of social control, more perfect than actual violence, because actual violence must be justified, documented, explained. Architectural threat
just exists, just hovers over every interaction, just shapes behavior constantly without anyone having to do anything except maintain visibility of holes and occasional reminder of what they're for. That's brilliant system. That's disturbing system. That's what Robert is recognizing and documenting. The quiet effectiveness of never executed threat. The perfect control of architectural violence that exists purely as possibility.
If you're feeling that recognition of how architectural features become control mechanisms, how spaces designed for defense function as daily coercion, how threat works better when never executed, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way unused violence shapes behavior more effectively than violence itself. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this understanding evolves, and share your thoughts about spaces that control through what they could do rather than what they do.
April.
Robert is training new guard, young man named Peter, teaching him Gatehouse procedures, how to check documents, how to manage traffic, how to resolve disputes. Peter asks about murder holes. Do we ever use them? Robert shakes his head. Never used them in my 5 years. Nobody I know has seen them used, but we reference them constantly, several times daily. Watch. They stand in Gatehouse observing. Within an hour, 3 separate situations arise where murder holes are referenced. Merchant arguing about fees. Robert, sir, you're standing under murder holes. Perhaps discuss this more calmly. Messenger demanding immediate priority. Guard, everyone waits their turn here. You see those holes above? That's what happens to people who cause problems. Drunk man being denied entry. Another guard, you're too intoxicated. Come back tomorrow and stop shouting. You're beneath the murder holes. Each time the reference quiets the situation. Each time behavior changes immediately. Peter notices. We're using them as threats, as control mechanism. That's not defense. That's coercion. Robert agrees. That's exactly what it is. That's what I'm trying to understand. Whether that's appropriate use, whether it's justified, whether it's effective policy or abuse of architectural features. What do you think? Peter considers. It works, prevents violence, prevents conflicts escalating, keeps Gatehouse functioning smoothly. That seems valuable. But it's also threatening people with violence we'd never actually use. That seems deceptive, like lying about capability we don't have. Robert nods. That's exactly the question. Are we lying? The murder holes exist. They could be used. The threat is technically real, just never executed. Is that a lie, or is that just effective use of existing architecture? I've been trying to decide, documenting instances, trying to understand whether this is good policy or troubling practice. They watch more interactions, see more references, see
how effectively they work. See how reliably people comply when reminded of murder holes above them. See that nobody ever challenges the threat. Nobody ever says, you wouldn't actually drop something on me. Nobody ever calls the bluff. Because maybe it's not bluff. Maybe holes could be used. Nobody wants to test it. That uncertainty is what makes threat effective. That doubt about whether it's real or empty. That inability to know whether Gatehouse staff would actually drop boiling water on troublesome person. That uncertainty makes everyone cautious, makes everyone compliant, makes everyone modify behavior to avoid testing whether threat is real. That's perfect control. That's what murder holes provide. Not defense, not violence, but uncertainty that produces compliance, that produces cooperation, that produces behavior modification through architectural features that may or may not ever be used, but definitely shape how people act every day. Peter understands. So our job is managing that uncertainty, maintaining threat without executing it, keeping possibility alive without actualizing it. That's complicated. That's manipulative maybe, but also effective. I don't know how to judge it morally, just know it works practically. Robert agrees. That's where I am too, knowing it works, not knowing whether it should, whether using architectural threat this way is appropriate, whether it's abuse of power or clever management, whether we're maintaining order or creating atmosphere of fear. I can't decide. Just keep documenting, keep watching, keep trying to understand what we're actually doing here.
They continue observing.
Continue noting references. Continue watching behavior change when murder holes are mentioned. The pattern is absolutely consistent. Threat works every time. Compliance is immediate. Behavior modification is reliable. Nobody ever challenges it. Nobody ever escalates after murder holes are referenced. The architectural threat is perfect control mechanism, more perfect than any actual enforcement could be, because actual enforcement would require justification, would create incident, would need documentation, would risk injury or death, would potentially create legal problems. Architectural threat avoids all of that, just exists, just shapes behavior, just controls interactions through presence and possibility. That's clean control. That's quiet justice. That's what Robert and Peter are recognizing they maintain, not through violence, through threat of violence that's never executed, through architectural features used for purpose they weren't designed for, but which they serve perfectly. That's their understanding. That's their documentation. That's what they're trying to judge morally while recognizing practically that it works better than any alternative they can imagine. That's the tension. That's the complexity. That's what they're navigating together as they learn how Gatehouse really functions and what murder holes actually do. Not defense, control. Not violence, threat. Not spectacle. Quiet effectiveness that operates beneath notice because nobody wants to think too carefully about why they're modifying behavior in Gatehouse Passage, about what exactly makes them compliant in that space, about whether the threat hovering over every interaction is real or theatrical. That uncertainty is what makes system work. That's what Robert and Peter maintain. That's their function. Managing architectural threat. Maintaining murder holes as a possibility that's never actualized but always present. That's their job. That's what they do. That's what
They're learning to understand and question and document while continuing to perform, because it works regardless of whether it's right. That tension between effectiveness and morality, between practical management and ethical concern, that's where they exist. That's their position. That's what they're navigating daily, while the murder holes hang above every interaction, and nobody ever actually drops anything through them, but everyone always modifies behavior because they might. That possibility is perfect control. That threat without execution is perfect violence. That architectural feature that functions purely as deterrent without ever being used as weapon is perfect system of quiet justice. That's what Gatehouse murder holes provide. That's what Robert and Peter maintain. That's what they're trying to understand and evaluate, while recognizing they can't stop managing, even if they conclude it's problematic, because effective control mechanisms aren't abandoned just because they're troubling. They're maintained, they're refined, they're passed to next generation. That's what's happening. That's the pattern. That's what this story documents.
June 1272. Robert and Peter have been documenting murder hole references for 3 months. The numbers are striking. References 167, actual uses 0. Compliance after reference 94% immediate. The murder holes are extraordinarily effective control mechanism that's never actually used as weapon. That statistical proof makes Robert question whether this is entirely appropriate. Makes him wonder whether they're manipulating people through empty threats, whether architectural violence as pure theatre is ethical even when effective. He raises this with Castle Steward. "Sir, I've been tracking murder hole references. We use them constantly as threat to control behavior in the Gatehouse, but we never actually use them, never drop anything, never employ them defensively. Is that appropriate? Are we essentially lying to people about danger they're in, using architectural features deceptively?" The steward considers. The murder holes exist. They're real. They could be used if necessary. You're not lying about their existence or capability. You're just reminding people of architectural reality they're passing through. That's information, not deception. Whether we choose to use them is our judgment based on circumstances. Maintaining that judgment as a possibility keeps people compliant without requiring violence. That's preferable to actually needing to use them. The threat prevents the necessity. That's not abuse. That's efficient control. Be glad we don't need to drop boiling water on people, but don't stop reminding them that we could.
That reminder prevents situations where we might actually need to. That's wisdom, not manipulation. That's official position. That's policy. That's justification for using murder holes as threat without execution. Robert understands the reasoning, understands that preventing violence through threat is preferable to using violence, but he's still uncomfortable, still uncertain whether they're manipulating
people unfairly, still questioning whether unused threat is ethical control mechanism, brings concerns to Peter. The steward says we're preventing violence by threatening it, that reminding people of murder holes stops situations escalating. That's true, but we're creating atmosphere where every passing through Gatehouse feels threatened, where every interaction happens under implicit coercion, where architectural violence shapes all behavior, even though violence never occurs. Is that appropriate? Is that the kind of castle we want to be, where fear maintains order, rather than respect or agreement or legitimate authority? Peter sees both sides. Fear is legitimate authority, when it prevents actual violence, when it keeps order without bloodshed. That seems valuable. But you're right that it creates atmosphere, makes Gatehouse uncomfortable space, makes people anxious passing through. That anxiety serves control, but also creates constant psychological pressure. I don't know whether that's justified cost for maintaining order. Seems like it depends on whether you value order over comfort, security over freedom from intimidation, practical management over ethical purity. Those are difficult trade-offs without obvious right answers. That's where they stand. Recognizing trade-offs, seeing costs and benefits, unable to determine whether murder holes as control mechanism are appropriate or problematic, just continuing to use them because they work and no better alternative presents itself. That continuation, while uncertain, is a form of complicity, is accepting a system they can't fully endorse, is operating a mechanism they question while lacking power or clarity to change it. That's their accommodation. That's their compromise. That's their participation in quiet justice that they recognize as effective but can't determine is ethical. That ambivalence defines their position. That uncertainty shapes their practice. That questioning without resolution characterizes their daily work managing Gatehouse, where murder holes control behavior perfectly without ever being used for violence. That's where Part 2 explores. That ambivalence, that compromise, that continuation despite uncertainty, that operation of system they question because they lack alternatives or authority to change it. That's their reality. That's their dilemma. That's what they navigate daily. If you're feeling that tension between effectiveness and ethics, between practical management and moral concerns, between using what works and questioning whether it's right, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way people maintain systems they can't fully endorse. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this dilemma intensifies, and share your experiences with operating systems you question but lack power to change.
July. Crisis demonstrates limits of architectural threat. Noble arrives at Gatehouse. Drunk. Aggressive. Demanding immediate entry despite evening hour when gates normally close. Guard explains protocol. Noble becomes furious, starts shouting. Guard references murder holes. Sir, you're beneath the murder holes. Please lower your voice and return tomorrow. The noble looks up, sneers. You think I'm frightened of holes in ceiling? You think you dare drop anything on me? I'm Baron Fitzwilliam's nephew. You touch me and my uncle destroys this castle. Your murder holes are empty threat. Now open the gates. The threat failed. The architectural violence didn't control behavior because this person calculated that status protects him from consequences, that social hierarchy supersedes architectural threat, that being noble means murder holes don't apply to you. That's limit of system Robert discovered. That murder holes only control people who believe they apply, people who think they might actually be used, people without status that protects them from architectural violence.
For privileged people who understand that violence has social limits that architecture can't overcome, the murder holes are empty theatre. The noble continues shouting, demanding entry, becoming more aggressive. Robert is present, must decide how to handle situation where architectural threat failed, where murder hole reference didn't work, where the system's limitation is exposed. He can't actually use murder holes, can't drop anything on drunk noble. That would create massive problems, would justify noble's accusation that threat was empty, would prove murder holes are unused because using them is impossible, not because they're effective as deterrent. Robert must find different approach, must manage situation without architectural violence that the noble has called bluff on, must maintain order using different tools. That moment reveals system's fundamental limitation, that architectural threat
only works when people believe consequences are possible, when status or calculation suggests violence might actually happen, when there's uncertainty about whether threat is real. Noble has no uncertainty, knows threats to nobles have different calculation, knows murder holes might control peasants but won't control him. That knowledge makes architectural violence useless, makes Robert's primary control mechanism irrelevant, forces him to manage without the tool he's relied on for 5 years. That's crisis. That's exposure of systems limits. That's moment where effectiveness breaks down. Robert must improvise. Sir, you're correct that your status requires special consideration. I cannot simply let you through against protocol. That would undermine all Gatehouse security and I'd be dismissed for incompetence. But I can escort you personally to the seneschal and let him make judgment about evening entry for someone of your importance. That preserves protocol while acknowledging that someone with your connections may merit exception. Would that be acceptable? It's flattery, it's accommodation, it's acknowledging what the noble already stated, that he's above normal rules. But it redirects to proper authority, makes the entry decision someone else's problem, removes Robert from having to either enforce rules or violate them. The noble accepts this solution. Robert escorts him to seneschal, who grants evening entry because denying noble would create problems with Baron Fitzwilliam. The noble enters. Situation resolved, but lesson is learned. Murder holes don't work on everyone, don't control people with sufficient status, don't apply to those who understand social hierarchy supersedes architectural threat. That limitation is fundamental. That's inherent in system of control based on threat without execution, because if threat is never executed, then status-aware people can calculate that it won't be executed on them specifically, can call bluff safely, can ignore.
Architectural violence meant to control others, but not applicable to them. That creates two-tier system. Murder holes control common people, don't control nobles. Architectural threat applies unequally based on social status. That inequality is how it functions. That's not flaw, that's feature. System designed to control most people while making exceptions for privileged. That's explicit class-based control. That's quiet justice that operates differently for different categories of people. That's what Robert fully understands now, that murder holes are class weapon, control mechanism that works on peasants and merchants and common travellers, but doesn't work on nobles who understand their status protects them. That architectural violence has social limits built into its application. That threat is reserved for people without power, while people with power can ignore it safely. That's deeply troubling recognition. That's exposure of system as not universal control, but class-specific coercion. That murder holes don't maintain order generally, they maintain class hierarchy specifically. They keep common people compliant while allowing nobles to be aggressive. They shape behavior unequally based on status. That's their actual function. Not defense, not universal control. Class enforcement, social hierarchy maintenance, keeping certain categories of people compliant through architectural violence that doesn't apply to privileged categories who can safely ignore it. That's what Robert sees now.
That's what Noble's defiance revealed. That murder holes are a tool of class control, not universal security. That they work only on people without status to protect them from consequences. That architectural threat applies unequally and intentionally. That quiet justice operates through architecture that controls some while exempting others. That's the system. That's how it functions. That's what Noble's defiance revealed. That murder holes are a tool of class control, not universal security. That they work only on people without status to protect them from consequences. That architectural threat applies unequally and intentionally. That quiet justice operates through architecture that controls some while exempting others. That's the system. That's how it functions. That's what Noble's defiance revealed. That murder holes are a tool of class control, not universal security.
Hierarchy, not security. Class enforcement, not universal control. Selective coercion. That's what murder holes do. That's what they've always done. Robert just didn't see it clearly until someone with status exposed the limit, until Noble demonstrated that architectural violence has social boundaries, that threats apply differentially, that gatehouse control is class-specific. That's complete understanding now. That's full recognition. That's awareness that changes how Robert understands his position and the tool he uses. He's not maintaining order. He's maintaining hierarchy. He's not preventing violence, he's preventing lower-class resistance. He's not managing Gatehouse neutrally, he's managing it as site where class distinctions are reinforced through architectural features that threaten poor people, while being irrelevant to rich people. That's his function. That's his role. That's what he does through references to murder holes that control some, while being meaningless to others. That recognition is uncomfortable. That awareness is troubling. That understanding complicates Robert's relationship to his work and the tool he employs. He can't just see murder holes as neutral control mechanism anymore. Must see them as class weapon, as hierarchical enforcement tool, as architectural violence that applies unequally and intentionally. That's what they are. That's how they function. That's what Drunk Noble's defiance revealed completely.
August. Robert shares recognition with Peter. The murder holes are class control tool. They work on common people, don't work on nobles. That's not limitation, that's design. They're meant to keep certain people compliant while allowing others freedom. That's troubling. That's not neutral control, that's hierarchical enforcement. Peter considers. Every control mechanism has class dimensions. Laws apply differently to rich and poor. Punishments vary by status. That's just how social order works. Why would architectural control be different? Why expect murder holes to apply equally when nothing else does? Robert struggles with this. Because I thought we were maintaining security neutrally, thought gatehouse control served everyone equally, protected everyone from disruption. But we're actually protecting class hierarchy, using architectural violence to keep common people compliant while nobles do whatever they want. That's not security, that's oppression. That's enforcing inequality through threat of violence directed only at powerless people. Peter pushes back. Would you prefer nobles also be subject to murder hole threats? Would you actually drop boiling water on a drunk noble who refused to comply? That would cause war, would destroy castle, would get us executed. The class difference isn't flaw in murder holes, it's reality of power. We can't threaten people with more power than us, can only threaten people with less. That's not unique to murder holes, that's universal truth about authority. We maintain order among people we can control, exempt people who can't be controlled without catastrophic consequences. That's not oppression, that's practical management within constraints. The alternative isn't treating everyone equally. It's acknowledging some people can't be controlled through threats because their status makes threats ineffective or too costly. Murder holes just make that reality architectural rather than purely social, but the reality exists either way.
That's pragmatic argument. That's acceptance of hierarchy as unchangeable. That's accommodation to class system as given rather than problem to solve. Peter is essentially saying Robert should accept that control mechanisms serve hierarchy because hierarchy is fundamental and unchangeable, that murder holes are doing what they're supposed to do by controlling some while exempting others, that Robert's discomfort is naive idealism about poverty that ignores social reality. That's one perspective. Robert isn't sure he accepts it, feels like accepting oppression rather than managing it, feels like endorsing class violence rather than reluctantly operating within constraints. But he also can't articulate clear alternative, can't explain how to maintain Gatehouse without architectural threat that inevitably applies unequally, can't propose better system, just feels uncomfortable with the one he operates. That discomfort without alternative is frustrating position. That awareness without power to change is demoralizing. That recognition of injustice without ability to address it is what people face constantly when working within hierarchical systems. Robert is experiencing that. That's his position now. Knowing murder holes enforce class hierarchy, unable to stop using them, unable to propose alternative, unable to refuse participation, just continuing while uncomfortable, continuing while aware, continuing while troubled. That's his accommodation. That's his compromise. That's his complicity in system he recognizes as unjust but can't escape or reform. That's part 2's conclusion. That awareness without options, that recognition without power, that discomfort without alternatives. Robert continues managing Gatehouse, continues using murder holes as a threat, but no longer comfortable with it, no longer convinced it's neutral control, just aware it's class enforcement and unable to change that, even though he wishes he could.
1273. Robert continues managing Gatehouse with full awareness that murder holes enforce class hierarchy rather than neutral security. That awareness doesn't change his practice, still references holes when needed, still uses architectural threat to control behavior. But the awareness changes how he feels about it, changes his relationship to work, creates distance between what he does and who he wants to be. That distance grows over year. That discomfort accumulates. That sense of participating in something unjust while being unable to stop intensifies. By spring 1273, Robert is struggling. Not with competence, he's excellent gatekeeper, but with conscience, with sense that he's maintaining oppressive system, with feeling complicit in class violence, even though violence never occurs. That struggle is what part 3 explores. How Robert navigates that discomfort, whether awareness leads anywhere, whether recognizing injustice produces any change, or whether it just makes continuing more painful without altering anything practical. That's the question part 3 addresses.
March 1273. Incident forces Robert's hand. Peasant woman is at Gatehouse demanding entry. She's trying to reach Earl to petition about unfair taxation in her village. Guard denies entry. Petitions go through proper channels. Steward's office. Submit written request. Wait for response. You can't just demand audience with Earl. The woman is desperate. We've submitted requests for 6 months. No response. My village is starving. The taxes are impossible. We need the Earl to know, to intervene, to show mercy. Please, just let me speak to someone with authority. Guard is unmoved. Protocol is protocol. Return through proper channels. The woman becomes emotional, starts crying, pleading, creating scene in Gatehouse passage. Guard gets frustrated. You're causing disruption. You need to leave, now, or I'll reference the murder holes. He points up, reminds woman of where she stands. The woman looks up at dark openings in ceiling, sees architectural threat, becomes terrified, stops crying, stops pleading, backs away from Gatehouse, leaves quietly, defeated. Robert watched entire interaction, feels sick. The murder holes just silenced desperate petition about starvation, just stopped woman from seeking help, just prevented potential relief for her village, not because her petition was wrong or her case was weak, because architectural threat made her too frightened to persist. That's not security. That's not order. That's oppression. That's using violence as threat to silence legitimate grievance. That's preventing petition that might have helped starving people. That's murder holes serving not defense, but suppression of legitimate political speech. That's what makes Robert's discomfort unbearable. That's what transforms awareness into crisis. He can't participate in that. Can't use murder holes to silence desperate people trying to petition for survival. Can't maintain system that treats seeking help as a problem to be controlled, rather than a need to be addressed. That's
too much. That's beyond what Robert can accommodate. That's where his awareness must produce action, must lead to something, must result in change. He can't continue operating murder holes as class weapon that silences desperate petitions. That's unacceptable. That's intolerable. That's where Robert draws line. He follows the woman outside Gatehouse, catches her in Outer Bailey. "Ma'am, I'm sorry that happened. I'm Robert, head gatekeeper. I saw the interaction. I understand your village needs help. I can't guarantee Earl will hear your petition, but I can try to get it to Steward directly. Tell me your village name and specific petition. I'll ensure it reaches someone who might help." The woman is surprised, suspicious. "Why would you help? You work for the guard who just threatened me with murder holes. Why should I trust you?" Robert doesn't have good answer. "Because I'm uncomfortable with how those holes are used. Because I think threatening desperate people is wrong. Because I have some access to castle administration and you don't. Because I can maybe help. That's all. I can't promise results, just promise to try." The woman considers, decides to trust, explains her village situation, the excessive taxation, the starvation, the unanswered petitions, the desperation. Robert takes notes. "I'll get this to Steward, emphasize urgency, request immediate review. That's all I can do." The woman thanks him, leaves. Robert is left with his notes and his decision to step outside his role, to use his position to help rather than control, to subvert Gatehouse function by facilitating petition that Gatehouse just suppressed. That's small rebellion, that's quiet resistance, that's using insider access to counter-effect of architectural threat. That's what awareness produced, not grand refusal, not dramatic protest, just small subversion, helping one person circumvent system that threatened her into silence. That's all Robert can do. That's what his awareness enables. Small acts of assistance that partially counter harm caused by murder holes he continues operating. That's insufficient. That's compromised. But it's something. It's different from pure complicity. It's an attempt to reduce harm even while participating in system that creates harm. That's Robert's resolution. That's his accommodation to awareness, not refusing completely, not continuing entirely unchanged, but finding small ways to help that partially offset participation in oppression. That's inadequate response to injustice. That's better than no response. That's what people do when they recognize problems but lack power to solve them. They help where they can. They subvert where possible. They assist in small ways while maintaining positions they can't afford to lose. That's Robert's pattern. That's his chosen response. That's what awareness produces when refusal is impossible, but continuing unchanged is intolerable. Small acts of counter-system assistance. Quiet helping that partially undermines the control he officially maintains. That's his resolution.
Thank you for staying with this difficult exploration of how architectural violence controls behavior, how threat works better when unused, how class hierarchy shapes who gets threatened and who gets exempted. If this changed how you think about spaces that control through possibility rather than execution, about how systems maintain order through fear of consequences that rarely happen, about how people navigate between complicity and resistance when trapped in unjust systems, subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your thoughts. Where do you see threat functioning better than execution? How do architectural features become control mechanisms? What do people do when they recognize oppression but lack power to stop it? I genuinely want to hear your reflections.
The petition Robert submitted doesn't help the woman's village immediately, gets lost in bureaucracy, gets delayed, gets treated as routine rather than urgent. That's how systems handle attempts to circumvent their control mechanisms, by absorbing resistance, by blunting impact, by ensuring that even successful circumvention doesn't produce meaningful change. Robert learns this, learns that his small resistance accomplished little, that helping one person doesn't address systematic oppression, that individual acts of assistance don't reform unjust systems, that awareness and good intentions aren't sufficient, that gatehouse murder holes continue controlling behavior regardless of Robert's discomfort or occasional attempts to help people they threaten. That's sobering recognition. That's realistic assessment. That's what makes Robert's position sustainable long-term. Understanding his help is insufficient. Understanding system is stronger than his resistance. Understanding awareness without power produces only small gestures that don't change fundamental injustice. That understanding allows Robert to continue, to maintain his position, to keep operating murder holes while helping occasionally, to live with complicity while performing small acts of counter-system assistance that make him feel marginally better without changing anything structural. That's his pattern for remaining years in position. That's his accommodation. That's his survival strategy within system he recognizes as unjust, operating what he can't refuse while helping where he can, participating while subverting occasionally, complying while resisting in small, insufficient ways. That's what awareness without power produces. That's realistic outcome. That's honest resolution that doesn't pretend individual consciousness transforms systems, or that small acts of resistance undo large structures of oppression. Robert continues as gatekeeper until 1280, 8 years after recognizing murder holes as class.
Weapon. 8 years of continued use. 8 years of occasional small acts of helping. 8 years of operating while uncomfortable. 8 years of awareness without fundamental change. That's his career. That's his legacy. That's his reality. Not hero, not villain, just person trapped in position where he maintains what he recognizes as unjust, while occasionally helping people harmed by system he cannot escape. That's common story. That's typical experience. That's what most people do when they recognize problems in systems they participate in, but lack power to reform. They continue participating while helping occasionally. They maintain complicity while performing small resistance. They operate unjust systems while assisting some people harmed by them. That contradiction is sustainable. That tension is manageable. That compromise allows continued functioning without breakdown. That's Robert. That's his resolution. That's what Gatehouse murder holes taught him about quiet justice and survival. That architectural violence controls through threat, never executed. That unused violence shapes behavior more effectively than actual violence. That threat works best when people fear it might be used, but can't know whether it will be. That uncertainty is perfect control. That possibility is perfect coercion. That architectural feature becomes perfect weapon precisely because it's never used as weapon. That's paradox. That's power. That's how murder holes function. Not as defense, as deterrent. Not as violence, as threat. Not as spectacle of execution, as quiet possibility that hangs over every interaction. That cooled tempers without spectacle by making every interaction happen under implicit threat that never needs to be executed because its presence is sufficient. That's elegant control. That's troubling justice. That's what Robert learned and operated and occasionally subverted and never changed. That's the system. That's how it works. That's what persists. Murder holes. Hanging unused above Gatehouse Passage, where everyone must pass, and everyone must look up, and everyone must be reminded that this space was designed for killing people who cause trouble, and that reminder shapes behavior constantly, without anything ever being dropped through the holes. That architectural violence as pure possibility, that threat as control mechanism, that unused weapon as perfect deterrent. That's what murder holes reveal about quiet justice, that it operates through threat more than execution, through possibility more than actuality, through fear of consequences that rarely occur, more than through experiencing consequences. That people modify behavior to avoid testing whether threat is real more reliably than they modify behavior after experiencing violence. That architectural features that embody threat shape interactions constantly. That space designed for violence controls people without violence needing to occur. That's sophisticated control. That's efficient oppression. That's how quiet justice works, through systems that threaten without executing, through architecture that embodies violence without performing it, through features that remind people of possible consequences without actually delivering consequences. That reminder is enough. That possibility is sufficient. That threat is perfect. That's what Robert learned. That's what he operated. That's what he never changed. That's what survived him. That's what persists. Murder holes still hanging above gatehouses, still unused, still controlling behavior, still cooling tempers without spectacle, still functioning as architectural threat that shapes interactions without ever being used for violence. That's their legacy. That's their function. That's what they reveal about how quiet justice operates through possibilities that are never actualized but always present, through threats that are never executed but always effective, through architectural violence that exists purely as deterrent,
without ever manifesting as actual harm. That's perfect system. That's troubling system. That's what murder holes are. That's what they do. That's what Robert understood and Peter documented and Castle maintained and people experienced, and nobody changed. That's the pattern. That's the mechanism. That's the revelation. Quiet justice operates through threat without execution, through possibility without actuality, through fear without violence, through architecture that embodies danger without manifesting danger, through control that works precisely because it's never used. That's the paradox. That's the power. That's what Gatehouse murder holes reveal about how oppression functions most efficiently. Not through spectacular violence that everyone witnesses, but through quiet threat that everyone imagines. Not through executions that create martyrs and incidents and resistance, but through possibilities that create compliance and accommodation and continued submission. That's perfect control. That's what survives. That's what persists. That's what Robert operated for 8 years, while helping occasionally and changing nothing fundamentally, and understanding completely that he was maintaining class-based oppression through architectural threat that applied unequally and never actually manifested as violence, but shaped everything anyway. That's his story. That's the lesson. That's what murder holes taught about quiet justice and everyday survival. That surviving means accommodating threats you can't escape. That justice operates through systems you participate in without endorsing. That everyday survival requires continuing under architectural violence that might never touch you, but shapes every interaction. That compliance comes from possibility, not actuality. That fear of consequences controls more effectively than experiencing consequences. That threat of violence maintains order better than violence itself. That's what unused murder holes reveal. That's their
Teaching. That's their function that persists across centuries in different forms, but identical logic. Threat controls. Possibility coerces. Architectural violence shapes behavior. Without spectacle, without execution, without actual harm occurring. Just potential hanging over every interaction. That's enough. That's sufficient. That's perfect control. That's quiet justice. That's what murder holes are. That's what they do. That's what they reveal.